September 15, 1944, Leyte Island, Philippines. The monsoon had turned the jungle floor into a labyrinth of mud and rotting vegetation. And somewhere in that green hell, Private Marcus Henley stood with his rifle pointed at the back of a kneeling man's head. The order was simple: execute the prisoner. But then, the Japanese soldier did something that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. He turned around, looked directly into the American's eyes, and saluted. In that split second, with his finger on the trigger, Marcus Henley discovered that some human gestures transcend the machinery of war, that recognition can occur even between sworn enemies, and that sometimes the wrong choice according to military protocol becomes the only right choice according to the human heart. This is the story of a moment when war's logic broke down, when a single act of unexpected dignity prevented what should have been just another forgotten execution, and how one man's inability to pull the trigger created ripples of humanity that spread far beyond that muddy clearing in the Philippine jungle. War trains us to see enemies as objects rather than individuals, to reduce complex human beings to strategic targets, to eliminate the personal recognition that makes killing psychologically difficult. Military training systematically removes the humanity from the enemy through dehumanizing language, propaganda that portrays opponents as fundamentally different, training exercises that condition soldiers to respond automatically to commands without moral hesitation. The entire machinery of warfare depends on this psychological transformation, the conversion of ordinary people into efficient instruments of violence who can kill without the burden of recognizing their targets as fellow human beings. But occasionally, the machinery breaks down. Occasionally, a moment occurs where the artificial barriers constructed by military training collapse, where the fundamental human capacity for recognition reasserts itself despite institutional attempts to suppress it. These moments represent cracks in the system, instances where individual moral agency resurfaces despite systematic attempts to eliminate such agency, where personal choice overcomes institutional programming designed to make such choices impossible. The Pacific War had become particularly brutal by September 1944, a conflict where racial hatred and cultural misunderstanding amplified the natural cruelty that war generates between any opposing forces. Japanese military culture's emphasis on death before surrender created situations where prisoner-taking became rare, where the normal conventions of warfare regarding captured enemy personnel often collapsed under the pressure of mutual dehumanization that both sides practiced with systematic efficiency. American forces had learned to expect that Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender, creating a battlefield psychology where taking prisoners became strategically problematic and emotionally complex. When captures did occur, the logistics of maintaining enemy personnel in jungle conditions with limited supplies created practical problems that military commanders solved through expedient policies that prioritized operational efficiency over humanitarian concerns regarding prisoner treatment. Standard operating procedures for dealing with Japanese prisoners had evolved to minimize the complications that live captives, created for units operating in hostile territory with limited resources for managing non-combatants. The official regulations maintained legal fiction about proper prisoner treatment, while unofficial practices adapted to battlefield realities that made such regulations impractical to implement consistently without compromising mission effectiveness and unit survival in environments where every additional burden could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Private Marcus Henley had been assigned prisoner guard duty as routine rotation among the less experienced members of his unit, a task that veteran soldiers avoided when possible, because of the psychological complications that prolonged contact with enemy personnel created for individuals who needed to maintain emotional distance from their targets in order to function effectively in combat situations that required killing without moral hesitation or personal recognition of enemy humanity. The Japanese soldier had been captured during a patrol encounter that left 3 American dead and 1 enemy survivor. who had been knocked unconscious by shrapnel, rather than choosing death over surrender, as military conditioning would typically demand. When he regained consciousness in American custody, he had shown none of the desperate resistance or suicidal behavior that captured Japanese soldiers usually exhibited, instead displaying a calm resignation that suggested acceptance of whatever fate his captors would determine for him. Marcus had expected the standard behaviors that American troops had learned to anticipate from Japanese prisoners, either fanatical attempts at escape that would justify immediate lethal response, or complete withdrawal into psychological states that made human interaction impossible. Instead, he encountered something unexpected, a prisoner who maintained personal dignity despite captivity. Tudor-Contreat, who acknowledged his guards with respectful recognition while accepting his circumstances without dramatic resistance or psychological collapse. The conversation that developed over the 3 days of shared presence occurred through gestures and the few English words that the prisoner had learned during his education in pre-war Japan. Communication that forced both men to focus on essential, human elements rather than the complex cultural and political differences that separated their nations and justified their mutual attempts to kill each other in service of competing imperial ambitions and conflicting definitions of Pacific regional authority. The Japanese soldier, whose name Marcus never learned, but whose face would remain vivid in memory for decades afterward, had shown photographs of his family during one of their limited interactions, images of a wife and 2 young children who represented the same fundamental human connections that motivated American soldiers fighting thousands of miles from their own homes and loved ones. The recognition of shared human experience created psychological complications that military training had not prepared Marcus to handle. Emotional connections that made the assigned task increasingly difficult to contemplate completing. On the morning of September 15th, orders came down through the chain of command that prisoner transport would be impractical given the unit's next operational assignment, and that the Japanese soldier should be disposed of through methods that would not compromise operational security or create evidence that might complicate post-war legal proceedings regarding prisoner treatment in cases where military necessity required deviation from standard protocols governing enemy personnel. Management in combat environments. Marcus received the direct order from his sergeant, a veteran of Guadalcanal who had learned to compartmentalize the moral complications that warfare created for individuals, required to make life-and-death decisions about enemy personnel under circumstances where textbook regulations provided inadequate guidance for complex situations that demanded immediate practical solutions to problems that political leadership and military planners had not anticipated or prepared adequate policies to address effectively. The execution was scheduled for dawn, in a clearing approximately 200 meters from the main camp where the sound would be muffled by jungle vegetation and the prisoners. Death could be accomplished without creating psychological complications for other unit members who might be affected by witnessing the elimination of someone they had observed. Behaving with recognizable human dignity, rather than the fanatical hatred that military propaganda had taught them to expect from Japanese enemy personnel. Marcus spent the night before the scheduled execution experiencing psychological conflict between his military training and his personal recognition of the prisoner's humanity, between the institutional loyalty that demanded obedience to orders and the individual moral agency that questioned whether following such orders represented appropriate action by someone who considered himself a decent human being fighting for democratic values against fascist authoritarianism and imperial aggression. At dawn, Marcus led the Japanese soldier to the designated clearing, both men understanding what was about to occur without requiring explicit verbal confirmation of the sentence that military necessity had determined. The prisoner walked calmly, without resistance or dramatic emotional display, maintaining the personal dignity that had characterized his behavior throughout the 3 days of captivity that had allowed Marcus to observe his essential human qualities rather than the dehumanized enemy image that military conditioning typically imposed on opposing forces. In the clearing, Marcus positioned the prisoner according to the instructions he had received, kneeling with his back toward the executioner to minimize the personal recognition that might complicate the psychological process of completing the assigned task. Standard procedure called for immediate completion of the order without prolonged interaction that might create emotional complications for the soldier required to carry out the elimination of enemy personnel under battlefield conditions where hesitation could compromise unit security and operational effectiveness. But then, the Japanese soldier did something that transformed a routine military execution into a moment of profound moral complexity. Instead of maintaining the prescribed position that would facilitate efficient completion of the task, he turned around, looked directly into Marcus's eyes, and offered a formal military salute that acknowledged not only the American's superior position as his captor, but also his recognition of Marcus as a fellow soldier deserving of professional respect despite the circumstances that had placed them in positions of mortal opposition. The salute lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in those seconds, Marcus experienced complete psychological transformation from seeing his target as an enemy object, requiring elimination, to recognizing him as a fellow human being, a professional soldier like himself, someone with personal dignity and family connections and individual worth that transcended the political circumstances that had created their military opposition. The gesture represented acknowledgement of shared humanity that cut through all the institutional barriers that military training had constructed to make killing psychologically possible. In that moment, Marcus discovered that his finger would not complete the trigger pull that his orders demanded. Despite months of training designed to create automatic response to military commands, despite institutional conditioning intended to eliminate personal moral agency in favor of efficient obedience to authority, despite the practical knowledge that refusing orders could result in court-martial and potentially execution for failure to follow direct commands in a combat environment, Marcus found himself unable to kill someone who had just acknowledged his humanity with professional respect. The hesitation extended beyond the planned timeline for completing the execution, creating a situation where the prisoner remained alive, contrary to explicit orders, while Marcus confronted the reality that his personal moral boundaries would not permit him to murder someone who had demonstrated individual dignity and professional recognition even while facing imminent death. The moment stretched into minutes as Marcus wrestled with conflicting loyalties: military duty versus personal conscience, institutional obedience versus individual moral agency. What happened next would be recorded differently in official reports and personal memory. But the essential fact remained that Marcus returned to camp with the prisoner still alive, claiming that equipment malfunction had prevented completion of the assigned task and requesting clarification about alternative procedures for handling the situation that had developed. Contrary to planned operational parameters, his sergeant, perhaps recognizing the psychological complications that such assignments created for inexperienced personnel, accepted the explanation without detailed investigation and reassigned prisoner responsibility to other unit members. The Japanese soldier survived the war, eventually repatriated through prisoner exchange programs that developed as American forces began preparing for post-war occupation, responsibilities that would require different policies regarding former enemy personnel. Years later, through International Red Cross records, Marcus learned that the man he had been ordered to kill had returned to his family in Osaka. Tifan had rebuilt his life as a schoolteacher and had lived to see his children grow up and establish families of their own. The ripple effects of that moment of hesitation extended far beyond the immediate preservation of one individual life. The Japanese soldier's survival meant that his knowledge of American battlefield practices remained available for post-war interviews that provided valuable intelligence about enemy treatment of prisoners, information that influenced development of more effective psychological warfare techniques and prisoner management protocols that reduced both American casualties and unnecessary enemy deaths in subsequent Pacific operations. More importantly, the moment when Marcus chose human recognition over military obedience represented proof that individual moral agency could survive institutional attempts to eliminate such agency, that personal conscience could reassert itself even in circumstances specifically designed to suppress moral consideration in favor of efficient violence. The choice demonstrated that humanity remained portable even in contexts where systematic dehumanization had created optimal conditions for eliminating the recognition that makes moral choice possible. The war ended 8 months later with Japanese surrender following the atomic bombings that eliminated the need for the planned invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives on both sides. Marcus returned to Kansas, married his childhood sweetheart, raised 3 children, worked as a high school history teacher, and never spoke publicly about the execution he had been ordered to carry out but couldn't complete because of a simple gesture of professional respect from an enemy soldier who chose to acknowledge their shared humanity rather than accept dehumanized death. But privately, in the quiet moments when memory retrieves experiences that shaped fundamental beliefs about human worth and moral responsibility, Marcus carried the knowledge that his inability to pull that trigger had represented the most important decision of his life. Not because it saved one Japanese soldier from execution, but because it demonstrated that human recognition transcends the artificial boundaries that political hatred and military necessity attempt to maintain between people who share more essential similarities than strategic differences. In a world where total war had demonstrated humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty, where institutional efficiency had proven capable of organizing mass violence on unprecedented scales, where political leadership had successfully convinced millions that certain people deserved elimination rather than recognition, the simple refusal to complete an execution order represented resistance to the dehumanizing logic that made such policies possible. The Japanese soldier's salute had reminded Marcus that respect is a choice individuals can make regardless of circumstances. That dignity remains portable across any distance, and that recognition of shared humanity represents the most fundamental form of resistance to institutional hatred. In choosing to honor that recognition rather than follow orders that required its elimination, Marcus discovered that moral courage sometimes means refusing to do what authority demands. The true loyalty to democratic values occasionally requires disobedience to specific commands that contradict those values. The clearing in the Philippine jungle where this encounter occurred has long since been reclaimed by vegetation. But the choice made there continues to resonate as evidence that individual humans retain moral agency, even in circumstances designed to eliminate such agency. That personal recognition can create spaces of dignity within systems of organized violence, and that sometimes the wrong choice, according to institutional logic, becomes the only right choice, according to human conscience. If stories like this remind you that courage often looks like hesitation, that humanity persists in war's darkest moments, then perhaps there are other instances of unexpected recognition worth remembering, worth honoring, worth carrying forward into whatever challenges require us to choose between the efficiency of hatred and the courage of acknowledgement across boundaries that politics insists must remain unbridgeable.